London, 1908. George Hackenschmidt, reigning world heavyweight wrestling champion, the first man in modern professional wrestling to hold that title, published a fitness manual. He was 30 years old. His chest measured 52 inches. His arms measured 19 inches. He weighed 204 pounds at 5 feet 9.5. He had gone through approximately 3,000 professional matches, with 2 losses, owned floor press records of 304 and 364 pounds, could snatch 197.5 pounds with one arm, and spoke several languages. Most biographical sources say 7. The book was called The Way to Live in Health and Physical Fitness. By 1940, after 21 editions, it was considered the largest-selling book on physical culture ever published. Inside its Victorian prose was a precise, methodical framework for progressive resistance training, training specificity, and the explicit distinction between strength-type and endurance-type physical development, concepts that sports science wouldn't formally name in peer-reviewed journals for another 40 to 70 years. This is the case for George Hackenschmidt, the actual evidentiary case, using his own words as exhibits and his own longevity as closing argument, that a man working in 1908 with iron, a trained eye, and an unusually systematic mind documented training principles that the scientific establishment would spend the next century rediscovering. Before the evidence, one foundational question deserves a direct answer. A channel called Natty Life owes its audience that directness, and this particular question has been conspicuously avoided. Was Hackenschmidt natural? Yes. Definitively, demonstrably, and with a paper trail that forecloses any serious counterargument. Testosterone was first synthesized in 1935. Adolf Butenandt in Göttingen and Leopold Ruzicka in Zurich independently isolated synthetic testosterone that year, work that earned them the 1939 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Hackenschmidt retired from professional wrestling in 1912. That is a 23-year gap between his final competitive match and the moment the molecule at the center of modern PED culture was first created in any laboratory anywhere on Earth. Anabolic steroids didn't enter documented athletic use until the early 1950s. American weightlifters experimenting with synthetic testosterone, Soviet teams using it at the 1952 Olympics. 40 years after Hackenschmidt walked away from the mat. What did exist in his era? Strychnine, which some athletes used as a stimulant. Thomas Hicks won the 1904 Olympic marathon on a documented combination of strychnine, brandy, and raw egg whites. Legal at the time, entered in the race record. Strychnine operates on the central nervous system. It can't produce a 52-inch chest because the biochemistry doesn't permit it. Cocaine preparations circulated among some endurance athletes. Alcohol was everywhere. None of these compounds produce muscular hypertrophy, and none of them are anabolic steroids. The argument that Hackenschmidt was probably on something requires a specific molecule, synthetic testosterone, that simply didn't exist during his career. That isn't skepticism. That is a pharmacological anachronism. Hackenschmidt's own writing rejected external stimulants explicitly. The Way to Live argues for moderation across all categories of life and against performance aids that substitute for systematic training. During his wrestling years, he consumed over 5 liters of milk daily and ate substantial amounts of animal protein, steak featuring regularly in his competition-era diet. His later decades moved toward a more plant-forward approach. Whatever the period, the philosophy was consistent. The physique was the product of the method, and the method was the point of the book. The natural status question is settled by dates, by chemistry, and by the man's own published record. Georg Karl Julius Hackenschmidt was born in Tartu, Estonia, on August 1, 1877. Tartu was still called Dorpat then, and Estonia was a province of the Russian Empire. His father was Baltic German. His mother had Estonian and Swedish ancestry. What he was born into wasn't athletic destiny. Accounts describe a sickly early childhood, a boy doctors supposedly doubted would survive, though the primary sourcing on that specific detail is thin, appearing in biographical summaries without clear attribution to primary records. What is documented is that there is no evidence of early athletic gifts, no youthful competition record, no visible sign of what was coming. What changed everything was the introduction of a system. In 1895, roughly 18 years old, Hackenschmidt began training under Dr. Vladislav von Krajewski in St. Petersburg. Von Krajewski wasn't a coach in any modern sense. He was a physician who had spent years conditioning the Russian military. a man who had thought carefully and specifically about how physical capacity was built in bodies that needed to perform under sustained pressure, not merely display themselves. His training hall worked with kettlebells, heavy barbells, and compound movement patterns designed for total body development. The orientation was entirely functional. How much force can this body produce? How much can it sustain? What sequence of demands over what period of time produces the most durable adaptation? Von Krajewski understood that strength wasn't a talent possessed by particular bodies. It was an adaptation that any body would produce in response to progressive demand, provided the demand was organized and the recovery was respected. Training under that framework changed Hackenschmidt within months in ways that became visible. By 1896, barely a year into systematic work, he pressed 214 pounds overhead with one arm, in a display that drew attention well beyond the St. Petersburg training community. By 1897, he had established several unofficial records in weightlifting. The progression reads less like athletic discovery than like the application of a mathematical argument verified in real time. If the body responds predictably to progressive loading, and you apply progressive loading consistently with adequate recovery, the outcomes follow as reliably as arithmetic. By 1901, he was winning international championship tournaments in Vienna and Paris. The European Greco-Roman Heavyweight Championship followed on September 4, 1902. The World Heavyweight Championship on January 30, 1904. He unified the title on May 4, 1905, defeating American champion Tom Jenkins, and the match records from that period produced the most rigorously documented physical measurements of his career. Height, 5 feet 9.5 inches. Weight, 204 pounds at competition leanness. Chest, 52 inches. Bicep, 19 inches. Neck, 22 inches. Thigh, 26 3/4 inches. Reach, 75 inches. These aren't promotional figures. They are match records, the most independently verifiable measurement source available from the era. Modern readers who encounter those numbers for the first time typically have the same reaction. That is a large human being. A 52-inch chest on a 204-pound frame carrying 19-inch arms isn't a physique that reads as modest in any historical period. What it looked like, and what Hackenschmidt's contemporaries actually wrote repeatedly in the press coverage of his matches and exhibitions, was classical sculpture. Not offered as a generic compliment, but as a specific aesthetic reference. Deep chest, proportionate shoulders, developed legs, visible muscular definition without distension or asymmetry, everything in correct relation to everything else. Contemporary accounts landed repeatedly on phrases like handsome as well as beautifully built, adored by women and admired by men, and became the darling of society. Photographs from the period reproduced across Europe. People came to his exhibitions not primarily to watch him compete, but to see what a human body built through 15 years of systematic progressive loading looked like at elite genetic expression. What they saw was a physique that seemed to confirm what Greek sculptors had been claiming about the human form for 2,000 years. The floor press records are harder to standardize against the era's inconsistent record keeping, but 304 pounds in one documented session and a reported maximum of 364 appear consistently in serious sources. His one-arm dumbbell snatch is cited at 197.5 pounds. He is credited with inventing the hack squat. The movement carries his name in every gym on earth, and with popularizing the floor press as a foundational strength movement before the modern bench press existed in its current configuration. These lifts were performed in an era before any of the pharmacological tools that modern competitive strength athletes use were synthesizable, let alone available for purchase. In approximately 3,000 professional matches, he lost twice, both times to the same man. Frank Gotch, American, Iowa-born, the only wrestler of the era mentioned in the same sentence, defeated Hackenschmidt first on April 3, 1908, in Chicago at Comiskey Park, ending with Hackenschmidt submitting to Gotch's toe hold at the 19-minute mark. Clean result, no controversy surrounding that outcome. The rematch, September 4, 1911, is categorically different in the historical record. Hackenschmidt maintained for decades that a training partner named Ad Santel had been paid $5,000 to injure his knee before the bout. The documented knee injury, the allegation, and the subsequent loss made the 1911 match one of the most disputed events in professional wrestling history. Academic papers analyzing the press coverage of both matches treat the sabotage question as unresolved. What isn't in dispute, Hackenschmidt retired from the ring in 1912 at 35 years old, carrying an approximately 3,000 match career record and 2 defeats. Gotch died in 1917 at 39 of kidney failure. The man who beat Hackenschmidt twice in a ring didn't live to see 40. Hackenschmidt would outlive that figure by more than half a century. After wrestling, he took the career arc that most athletes don't. He moved directly into philosophy. The Complete Science of Wrestling appeared in 1909, then Man and Cosmic Antagonism, To Mind and Spirit in 1935, Fitness and Yourself in 1937, and Consciousness and Character the same year. 7 books across the span of his life, moving progressively from the physical into the metaphysical. He reportedly challenged Albert Einstein to debate the theory of relativity. That claim appears in secondary biographical sources and circulated during his lifetime without apparent denial, which at minimum reveals something about how Hackenschmidt understood his own intellectual standing. Contemporary observers who encountered him in this later period described a philosopher and intellectual whose gentleness and soft-spoken civility belied his heavily muscled physique. He was in his 50s and 60s writing about cosmology and human consciousness. Through his 80s, he bench-pressed 150 pounds and ran 7 miles in 45 minutes. He died in London on February 19, 1968, 90 years old, still training. And online, people call him small. The Way to Live appeared from Athletic Publications, London, in 1908, the same year Hackenschmidt lost his world title to Gotch in Chicago. Whatever that April afternoon in Illinois cost him, the book outlasted everything. By 1940, 32 years after publication and 21 editions deep, it had earned the designation of largest-selling physical culture book ever published. Today, it sits on archive.org in its original form, free, 116 years old, available to anyone with a browser. To understand what made the book unusual, you have to understand what surrounded it. Physical culture publishing in 1908 wasn't a precise discipline. Eugen Sandow, the era's other dominant physical culture figure, published training manuals heavily entangled with his personal brand and showmanship apparatus. Bernard McFadden's Physical Culture magazine, which reached hundreds of thousands of readers, mixed genuine training advice with pseudoscience and dietary extremism in proportions that changed dramatically by issue. The genre had enormous enthusiasm for physical development and almost no systematic methodology. No formal distinction between training adaptations, no named protocols for progressive loading, no institutional framework that could evaluate, test, and codify what serious athletes had been observing empirically for decades about how the body responds to resistance. The discipline that would eventually become exercise science didn't yet exist in any organized form. Hackenschmidt was candid about this context. He wrote directly in the book's introduction that he didn't claim to be the first preacher of these ideas. The value wasn't originality of concept, it was systematization. 15 years of elite competitive training, the accumulated empirical observations of von Krajewski's methodology translated into a numbered and teachable framework that a literate person anywhere could implement without access to a trainer of that caliber. At the center of that framework sat this passage: beginning your exercises using a weight you could lift 10 times, but only performing 5 repetitions. Every week, you are to add 1 repetition to each set until you complete 10 repetitions. At that point, you may increase the weight by the next increment and begin again at 5 repetitions. That is progressive resistance exercise, not an approximation of it, not a gesture toward it, the mechanism itself stated with the precision of an algorithm. Start submaximally, accumulate repetitions week over week, reset when load increases, repeat indefinitely. In May 1948, Thomas DeLorme and Arthur Watkins published Techniques of Progressive Resistance Exercise, in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, the formal scientific naming and clinical codification of this exact principle. Delorme had been developing the system since 1945, originally to restore muscle function in injured World War II veterans. The 1948 paper formalized it into clinical methodology: 3 sets of 10, progressively heavier loads, systematically documented across sessions. Exercise science cites Delorme as the foundational figure who transformed resistance training from intuitive practice into an institutional discipline. Hackenschmidt put the identical mechanism in print 40 years earlier. 1908 to 1948 is exactly 40 years, and a book that reached 21 commercial editions wasn't an obscure pamphlet. The information was publicly accessible for 4 decades before Delorme named it. The institutional structure that would validate it simply hadn't formed yet. The strength versus endurance distinction runs through the way to live as a structural organizing principle rather than a footnote. Hackenschmidt explicitly described a training mode involving avoiding great feats of strength but performing feats of endurance. 2 distinct stimuli, 2 distinct adaptation pathways requiring different loading parameters and producing different physical outcomes. His chapter architecture reflects this division and builds around it. The formal scientific consensus establishing that strength and hypertrophy operate as independently trainable outcomes, meaning different rep ranges and loading intensities produce meaningfully different physiological results and can't be treated as interchangeable, wasn't consolidated in peer-reviewed literature until the 2000s and 2010s. A 2017 paper by Schoenfeld and colleagues, published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, directly compared strength and hypertrophy adaptations between low-load and high-load resistance training protocols and confirmed that they diverge. Hackenschmidt had described this as a practical training consideration more than a century earlier without access to the laboratory infrastructure that study required to publish the same finding. Periodization, organizing training into phases with distinct objectives, tells a parallel story. The Way to Live contains structured timetables for training and phase-organized programs with distinct developmental periods. Lev Matveyev published Periodization of Sports Training in Russian in 1965, 57 years after Hackenschmidt's book appeared. Western coaches didn't access Matveyev's formalized model in translated form until the 1980s. Tudor Bompa introduced periodization theory to Western training methodology in Romania in the early 1960s. Either way, the phase-organized training structure that Hackenschmidt applied practically in 1908 wasn't codified in academic literature for decades and didn't reach widespread Western coaching adoption for the better part of a century. 40 years for progressive overload, more than 50 years for the formal periodization model, more than a century before the high-load versus low-load hypertrophy distinction reached peer-reviewed resolution. The connective tissue passage in the book is particularly striking for how contemporary it reads. Hackenschmidt wrote, "The development of the sinews may be neglected, and it's the sinews which transport the action of the muscles to the bone frame. The sinews can only be exercised and strengthened by correspondingly heavy muscle work." He was describing tendon and ligament adaptation as a specific physiological outcome of resistance training, distinct from muscular hypertrophy, requiring progressive mechanical loading to produce. This is standard content in any accredited sports science program today. He stated it as a plain observation in 1908 in a paragraph he apparently didn't consider particularly novel. On recovery. Don't perform any exercise to excess so as to tire yourself out. Use moderation and common sense. Remember that excessive and rapid exercising is harmful. On structural balance. All muscle groups should be equally developed, those which are naturally weaker to a greater extent than the others, until all are equally strong. These read today like excerpts from an introductory personal training textbook. In 1908, they appeared in a commercial publication written by a wrestler without institutional backing because the author had observed them empirically over a 15-year career and concluded they were true. Then there is the line that operates as the philosophical spine of the entire book. If physical exercises alone, without your will and mind, were all that was needful, Everyone could become a strong man, whether he be a brain or muscle worker. That sentence describes something beyond conventional training advice. The body responds to load. That part is mechanical. But the organized application of progressive load, sustained over years, directed towards specific developmental goals, requires something the load itself can't provide: deliberate engagement. Conscious attention to the adaptation process. The mental architecture that converts repeated physical effort into a coherent, long-term project. What Hackenschmidt was describing is what sports psychology would eventually identify as deliberate practice. Effortful, cognitively engaged training aimed at specific outcomes rather than mere repetition of familiar movements. He was working from observation. The observation was accurate. The formal science came decades later. Modern strength communities have located the book and recognize what it contains. Starting Strength published analysis of the way to live. The Barbell Medicine Group noted its alignment with current evidence-based training methodology. The academic paper that formally placed Hackenschmidt in the exercise science record, published in Iron Game History and authored by Florian Hem and Jan Todd, carries the title Beyond the Hack Squat: George Hackenschmidt's Forgotten Legacy as a Strength Training Pioneer. Forgotten is doing meaningful work in that title. The book ran through 21 editions. The Hack Squat carries his name in every gym on earth today. He wasn't forgotten by practitioners. He was simply omitted from the scientific genealogy that developed through institutional channels, which didn't reach backward to a commercial training book from 1908, written by an Estonian wrestler who also had active opinions about cosmology. For practitioners who want the program structure directly, Hackenschmidt recommended training the full body 3 to 6 days per week, with sessions as brief as 30 minutes. His stated preference was daily training when time allowed, but he explicitly endorsed 3 to 4 days as effective. He organized the work into 3 categories: bodyweight exercises, barbell and dumbbell movements, and specialized athletic training: compound, full body, progressively loaded. Neck bridging appears as one component within a larger system built primarily around heavy compound movements. The 30-minute minimum is the detail modern readers find most counterintuitive. The 52-inch chest and 19-inch arms came from sessions potentially as short as half an hour, run with consistency and progression over years. The mechanism was doing the work, not the duration. 3 specific dismissive arguments circulate in online discussions of Bronze Era athletes, and all 3 deserve specific answers. The first, 5'9" and 200 pounds isn't actually big. The 1905 match records document Hackenschmidt at 204 pounds with a 52-inch chest and 19-inch arms, at competition-ready body composition, not an inflated off-season weight, not a pumped measurement taken immediately post-session. Those numbers, achieved without pharmaceutical intervention, represent the upper boundary of what natural human development produces at elite genetic expression and decades of elite training volume. The suggestion that this is not actually big reveals nothing about Hackenschmidt's physique. It reveals what comparison class the person making that argument is using as their baseline. The comparison being made is against modern, mass monster bodybuilding physiques, a category that requires growth hormone, insulin, and multiple stacked anabolic compounds running simultaneously to produce. Calling that standard the definition of big treats pharmaceutical investment as a feature of the physique rather than a precondition for it. The Greek aesthetic that Hackenschmidt's contemporaries invoked specifically when describing him, deep chest, proportionate shoulders, powerful legs, visible definition, nothing grotesque, nothing distended, was a proportional argument about what systematic natural development looks like at its ceiling. The mass monster physique of modern professional bodybuilding is categorically different. Pharmacologically enlarged mass, distributed in ways that have no historical precedent because the compounds producing it have no historical precedent. Measuring both against the same scale and finding Hackenschmidt lacking isn't a neutral physical comparison. It's measuring a natural athlete against the output of a pharmaceutical delivery system and concluding the natural athlete fell short. The second claim, he was probably on something anyway. Testosterone synthesis, 1935. Hackenschmidt's retirement, 1912. 23 years separate his final competitive match from the first laboratory creation of the compound in question. Documented anabolic steroid use in athletics, early 1950s. 40 years after his retirement. The strychnine available in his era operates on the nervous system and produces no anabolic effects whatsoever. No compound available in 1908 produces muscular hypertrophy of the kind his competition measurements document. The argument is settled by a timeline, not by an opinion. The third, modern athletes are bigger, therefore the sport has progressed. A preprint study analyzing bodybuilder lifespans across 3 historical eras produced numbers that deserve to be read slowly. Bronze Era athletes averaged 74.8 years of lifespan. Silver Era athletes averaged 80.2 years. The Golden Era, the systematic PED era, averaged 68.6 years. The era with the most pharmaceutical infrastructure produced the shortest average lifespan of the 3 by more than 6 years compared to the Bronze Era and by more than 11 years compared to the Silver Era. Hackenschmidt's 90 years sits more than 20 years above the Golden Era average. He was bench pressing 150 pounds and running 7 miles in 45 minutes in his 80s, while professionals from modern bodybuilding's pharmaceutical era were dying of cardiac events in their 40s. The mechanism is documented in peer-reviewed literature. Prolonged human growth hormone use alters visceral fat storage and increases gastrointestinal wall thickness. Chronic insulin use in combination with HGH produces the condition medically termed abdominal hypertrophy syndrome, known as palumboism, named after bodybuilder David Palumbo, or informally as HGH gut. The distended abdomen visible on stage-ready professional competitors in modern bodybuilding isn't accumulated muscle. It's pharmacologically enlarged visceral organs and thickened gastrointestinal tissue sitting inside a hollowed-out abdominal cavity. Long-term anabolic steroid use associates in peer-reviewed literature with arrhythmia, unfavorable lipid profiles, elevated blood pressure, and significantly increased cardiovascular morbidity. The elevated cardiac death risk among professional bodybuilders reflects decades of research arriving at the same conclusion from different methodological directions. What the mass monster physique actually measures isn't purely muscular development. It measures muscular development plus pharmacologically enlarged organs plus altered visceral fat distribution plus the compounding cardiovascular debt that accumulates from years of stacked pharmaceutical protocols. The size is real. The cost of that specific configuration of size is documented in mortality statistics, in cardiac event rates, in the organ enlargement that stage photographs make visible to anyone who knows what they're looking at. Hackenschmidt's physique measured something different. At 204 pounds with a 52-inch chest and 19-inch arms, his body reflected decades, from his 1895 training start through competitive peak and beyond, of progressive mechanical loading applied systematically to a body allowed to adapt through its own biological mechanisms. The result looked like classical sculpture because classical sculpture was documenting the same thing from the opposite direction. The upper aesthetic boundary of natural human physical development at genuine excellence. What the Greeks rendered in marble, Hackenschmidt built in flesh, and both pointed to the same ceiling. Frank Gotch defeated him twice, in 1908 and 1911, the only man to do so in Hackenschmidt's entire career. Gotch was dead at 39 of kidney failure in 1917. Hackenschmidt trained in his 9th decade and died in 1968, having outlived his only rival by more than 50 years. The gap between 39 and 90 is data about what different relationships with the athletic body produce across a lifetime. It's also the gap between a man who beat Hackenschmidt in a ring and a man who outlasted him by half a century, writing philosophy while his records still held, his name still on the squat rack in every gym on Earth. So why do people keep calling him small? Because the reference point shifted through pharmaceutical escalation, and anything predating those inputs reads as inadequate against a standard the inputs created. The comparison is between categorically different physical projects treated as if they are gradations of the same pursuit. George Hackenschmidt published his method in 1908. He described the progressive overload system that Delorme would formally name 40 years later. He distinguished between strength and endurance training in terms that peer-reviewed literature would study more than a century later. He organized his program in phases that Matveyev wouldn't formalize in academic literature for another 57 years. He did all of this at 204 pounds with a 52-inch chest and 19-inch arms, while holding the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship, speaking several languages, and writing what would become the largest-selling physical culture book ever published. He wrote, "The knowledge of one's strength entails a real mastery over oneself. It breeds energy and courage, helps one over the most difficult tasks of life." That sentence describes what the deliberate practice of building yourself, progressively, honestly, without shortcuts, over decades, produces in a person as a durable quality: self-knowledge. The capacity to meet difficulty with something real behind it. Courage that accumulates incrementally across years of showing up and adding one repetition to each set until the weight increases and the process begins again. None of that arrives in a vial. None of it registers in measurements of peak stage weight. The academic paper that placed him in the scholarly record is called Beyond the Hack Squat: George Hackenschmidt's Forgotten Legacy as a Strength Training Pioneer. Forgotten by institutions, not by practitioners. The book ran 21 editions. The hack squat carries his name in every gym on Earth. Starting Strength cites him. Barbell Medicine cites him. The original text is on archive.org. Free, searchable, 116 years old. Read the progressive overload protocol. Read the strength versus endurance distinction. Read the connective tissue passage and the recovery principles and the mind-body integration argument. Read them alongside a current NSCA textbook and note what overlaps between 1908 and now. He knew. He wrote it down. He demonstrated it on his own body across 90 years. And 56 years after he retired from competition, the scientific literature was still publishing papers confirming what he had put in print in the year Frank Gotch took his title. A man who, unlike Hackenschmidt, didn't live to see 40. Subscribe for more stories like this.